Hello, I'm Penny Jane Burke, and I'm Director of the Center of Excellence for Equity in Higher Education and Global Innovation Chair of Equity at the University of Newcastle. And I'm really delighted and honored to be here this morning with you to launch the conference, to have the opportunity to share some of my work and ideas with you. And I do hope that these resonate throughout your conversations in the conference and also beyond it. I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land and pay my deepest respects to elders past, present, and future. And today I'm going to be focusing on the idea of changing pedagogical spaces in relationship to questions of inequality, diversity, and difference. So to start, my overview for today is that I'm going to start with the autobiography of the question, say a little bit about that, explore why pedagogy matters in relationship to diversity and difference, thinking about how we can develop reflexive approaches to our pedagogical practice, and then move towards the notion of pedagogies of difference and how social justice principles can help us to affect transformative change in higher education. So to start, I just want to situate myself and give you a sense of where I'm coming from. I'm a sociologist and feminist of higher education studies, and this is some of my work here. For the past 2 decades, I've been passionately committed to developing pedagogies and methodologies towards social justice in, through, and beyond higher education, including lifelong learning. My 2007 book, Reconceptualizing Lifelong Learning with Sue Jackson, was really about thinking about not just pedagogies and identities in higher education, but also in lifelong learning and the relationship between these. A lot of the ideas that I talk about today are in my book, The Right to Higher Education, which was published in 2012, and also Changing Pedagogical Spaces in Higher Education, co-authored with Jill Crozier and Laura Maziasek, published in 2017. I also have Pedagogy of the Oppressed up on the screen because critical pedagogies and Freirean theories around that have been very much influential in my thinking. And I think probably in most of our thinking, any of us who are committed to social justice education will in some way have been influenced, I think, by Paulo Freire's work, even if we haven't read it before, because his work has been so seminal, it's kind of seeped into the understanding around critical pedagogies and pedagogies that are committed to equity and social justice in higher education and in lifelong learning. I also have Nancy Fraser's Justice Interruptus book on the screen, which is really important as well. Her multidimensional social justice framework of redistribution, recognition, and representation are so important in thinking about social justice in higher education and in our pedagogical practices, and I'll talk about that in a little bit more detail as I go through. And I've been involved for over 10 years as an executive editor, and for 5 of those years as chief editor of Teaching in Higher Education, Taylor and Francis International Peer-Reviewed Journal, which actually has a subtitle now, Critical Perspectives. It's been really crucial. It's over 25 years old in developing a field of critical practice in higher education with a focus on teaching and learning. So to start with the autobiography of the question, which is a very, I think, powerful concept that I draw from Jane Miller in particular, but a lot of feminist and critical theorists have foregrounded the importance of looking at the relationship between the questions we ask, whether that's in research or in our professional practice, and the personal experiences and histories we bring to that question, but how that connects with broader, wider questions within our disciplinary field, within our professional community of practice, and the institutional histories behind that, and how that relates to our own and also others' sense of identity and self, and all those differences that make a difference. So that includes really taking a close-up look at the values that are at play within our different professional contexts, but also that we bring, sometimes without clearly thinking about what those are, and how different values are contested in pedagogical spaces. So whose values are valued, how do those values shape the pedagogical processes and practices at play, how and in what ways, whose values are excluded, and what effect does that have on different participants, whether that's staff or students, experiences and identity and sense of belonging and capability and being valued as a person. So why am I interested in these kinds of questions? Well, it really stems from my own autobiographical history and experience of accessing higher education as a so-called non-traditional student at a time when I was incredibly vulnerable, experiencing a profound sense of dislocation. I had been dislocated from my home in California to the UK, and I fled a very severe experience of domestic violence, and was far away from family and friends with a small child and trying to find ways to rebuild my life. And I was very lucky to discover access to higher education, which is like our Australian enabling programs. And through that process, I really began to observe, not just for myself, but also for my peers, the power of pedagogy in creating a sense of belonging and inclusion, or the opposite, of profound exclusion and undermining a sense of confidence and capability, and how important that was. And I went on to design my own access courses to teach, to moderate, to externally examine, and also to work in other higher education spaces, including undergraduate and postgraduate, where pedagogy still seemed to matter so much, even at the level of doctoral supervision. So my argument is that pedagogy matters a lot. However, in the mainstream policy and discourse, it seems to me, from the work that I've done over many years now, the research that I've conducted and the literature that I've reviewed, that the commitment to equity and widening participation in higher education tends to be seen as outside the realm of teaching and learning, as something peripheral to it, as something that we do in widening participation, community-based outreach, for example, in schools, or as remedial forms of student support through student support services outside of the programs of study. So, what is the relationship between our teaching and learning, our pedagogical practices, and questions of equity, inclusion, diversity, and difference, and challenging inequalities? And I think part of the problem is the ongoing contemporary emphasis on method, on style, on modes of delivery. And delivery is a word that I find very hard to swallow in this space, because it reduces what is a really complex set of educational processes to something that's packaged as a product that can be delivered. And, Paulo Freire's, one of his most important critiques was around the notion of banking education, the idea of situating students as passive recipients of the knowledge that is, simply transferred from the teacher, the knowing subject, to the passive recipient, that form of delivery. And so we need to really challenge some of those discourses, because they feed into our pedagogical imagination and the way we talk about teaching and learning. What I want to argue for is a much broader, richer sensibility of pedagogy, drawing on all of the body of work that helps us to think in different ways about pedagogy. I have here Bell Hooks' Teaching to Transgress as one important example of the rich work that's built on Freire's Pedagogy of the Oppressed and Pedagogy of Hope. So we need to think more about the richness and complexity of teaching and learning in terms of our identities as teachers, our identities as students. What does that mean in terms of our diverse and different experiences, histories, values, and perspectives? How do we develop an inclusive culture when there are, different competing cultures at play within any one pedagogical space? And what kinds of practices do we take up? How are those taken for granted as deeply embedded social practices that have been institutionalized? The lecture, for example, the tutorial, the seminar, and increasingly, notions of online learning, blended learning, the flipped classroom, that are absent from concerns with the different contextual dynamics at play and the relationship of our pedagogical experiences to long-standing historical inequalities and exclusions that have been institutionalized in higher education, which is a space that has been constructed through the inclusion of particular social groups and the exclusion of other groups. So we need to keep that in view. How does that affect the different practices we take up and the different kinds of knowledges and knowing practices that are legitimated within the university? And in relation to that, how do we explore the lived embodied practices? These are not just methods outside of our lived experience. They're experienced on an everyday level, and they're embodied. So in terms of the lecture, for example, they're embodied in the ways in which the professor, the professorial authority is taken up at the forefront of the classroom space as the knowing voice. And the authority, the way that authority is constructed, is around a particular kind of body. And that embodied practice may be taken up by different bodies, women, men, female, male, working class, middle class backgrounds, and so on. But those histories of the embodiment of that practice still remain in terms of how authority itself, how knowledge itself is being constructed. So they're more than simply style, skills, or techniques that we straightforwardly implement. These are about social practices that are embodied and that form a sense of knowledge, power, authority, and the relationship between those domains of knowledge, power, and authority, and our students who are embedded in a process of becoming capable, I suppose, within a particular field of practice, like public health. So as they strive to become public health professionals, to learn the knowledges that are legitimated within that field of practice, what are the processes of identity making and knowledge formation that come to play through our pedagogical encounters, through the making of meaning and understanding and knowing through our pedagogical encounters. And so dynamics is a really important concept there, because it helps us to think about how power plays out in those pedagogical spaces, that it's not a simple have it, don't have it, even oppressed, oppressor, advantaged, disadvantaged. And difference helps us to think about how these binary notions of power are problematic, that differences play out and power plays out in quite complex ways. And power itself is generative, it's productive, it can be oppressive, and it's fluid and dynamic. It's not something that we can always predict that it's going to play out in very specific ways which means that any kind of how to create inclusion and belonging isn't going to work, because what we need are the tools to be able to think through the different pedagogical encounters we have as we have them in different spaces, in different times of of our practice. And within this, we need to think about the emotionality of our experiences of pedagogy in higher education, because our emotional experiences are entangled in pleasure, joy, the joy of learning, but also the pain, the struggle, the struggle to know, and to know in the right kinds of ways, and to be the right kind of person. And my book, The Right to Higher Education, is very much about that. It's about how forms of recognition play out, so that being seen to have the right to higher education, which includes notions of potential, talent, capability, ability, and so forth, are subjective processes in which personhood is being formed, is being performed, so that we perform the self in ways that can be recognized as having talent or not, as having potential or not, as being capable or not, by the person who has the authority to make those judgments. So we have to be very mindful of those kinds of things. And diversity is a term that is increasingly predominant in contemporary higher education policy and practice, very important to our commitment to concerns with equity and inclusion. But critiques of diversity have also revealed that the ways in which it's framed are often through a lens of marketing, of ranking, showing that we're a diverse institution, being able to project images of the institutional identity as one that's committed to diversity. So, images like I have on the screen of happy faces, happy diverse faces, which fails to attend to and conceals the histories of inequality that shape different experiences of teaching and learning in higher education. The focus tends to be on redistribution. So coming to Fraser's ideas of redistribution, which are incredibly important, the idea that we redistribute resources, opportunities, funding, and so on, to ensure that students from underrepresented backgrounds have the opportunity to access and participate in higher education with fair mechanisms, and are treated within an equal playing field. And that is the goal. But that's about treating people the same. It's about equal treatment. Very, very important. Trying to level the playing field. But what that focus on redistribution doesn't address is questions of recognition and misrecognition, which are more subtle and more insidious in the ways inequalities play out historically and institutionally in university spaces. So the ways in which different people or different communities of people have been pathologized or marginalized in the discourses of diversity, or in the commitment to inclusion, where inclusion is about assimilating to the dominant culture of the university, or what is seen as the dominant culture of the university. So inclusion becomes almost a form of symbolic violence, in which the other, the person who's been seen as excluded from, has to conform to the practices of the mainstream culture of the institution, and change themselves to fit in and to belong, rather than to think about the historical practices being embedded in inequalities and how we can transform those to be more inclusive and to recognize difference. So difference is a really important concept in thinking about some of the ways that we imagine the groups that should be targeted by equity policy, for example. So we often put people into particular categorizations, whether that's a binary notion of gender that doesn't recognize gender differences, or whether that's about socioeconomic status that names a socioeconomic status in a particular way as if that group of people is that one thing. You know, you become homogenized as low socioeconomic status, for example. And that doesn't recognize the differences at play within different communities and across different communities. And the different, not only the different experiences, but also different identities and different values at play, different histories, different knowledges, some which are privileged in university policy and practice, and some which are excluded from view. And that brings us to that notion again of Fraser's misrecognition. So in thinking about questions of difference and misrecognition, we are enabled to have a more sophisticated notion of building inclusive pedagogies beyond that idea that, you know, we only belong to these homogenized categories and we just redistribute resources across those as the only kind of way to think about questions of inclusion or questions of diversity. And it's also important to be thinking about the history of higher education in relation to broader purposes and broader goals, because higher education can be a site of reproduction, the reproduction of particular kinds of identities. So if we think about, for example, the way that gender plays out in different subject areas, where female students are predominantly in those fields that are associated with femininity, like teaching, nursing, and social work, and are less represented in subject areas that are historically associated with masculinity, like engineering and physics and technology, for example, then we end up just reproducing the same patterns if we're not thinking about not only the numbers of people in those subjects, but the cultural practices within those subject areas and how they may be inclusive or exclusive of different groups. So let's think a little bit more about misrecognition and how those are ongoing injuries of the self. So the pathologizing gaze of misrecognition is projected onto those who are often perceived as suffering from deficit disorders, so that material poverty is often projected as a poverty of a range of different lacks: lack of aspiration, lack of confidence, lack of resilience, and so on. Structural and historical inequalities are misframed as located in the individual. So we erase from view those broader macro level structural and discursive inequalities at play that are historical and are institutionalized in our cultures and practices. And we focus instead on the individual who is, who is seen as suffering a range of deficit disorders. One of the important things about this, as well as to not slip into a simplistic solution that sees deficit as only about the language that we use, because it's much more than language. It's about the very way we frame the problem or the questions we ask in the first place. How we think about our teaching, for example, in relationship to questions of inclusion and diversity, and how we think about our strategies and how we frame those might be deeply embedded in a deficit imagination, even if we stop using language like low socioeconomic student. So I prefer talking about students from underrepresented backgrounds. Not that that's a perfect solution, but it helps to understand that the main identity is not low socioeconomic status. It is the student, it is the person. And being underrepresented is about the histories of structural inequality that are, the problem of that history of the institution rather than the person themselves. However, one of the relationships between the macro and the micro is that often these structural and discursive inequalities become internalized in the sense of self and become part of the embodied sensibility of self through the internalization of shame, self-denigration, and the fear of being an imposter or not being good enough, which I think is recognizable. We've talked a lot about imposter syndrome in contemporary higher education discourse, but again, that's not just about the person lacking confidence, that's about the ways in which histories of inequality and misrecognition come to play in the sense of self as not being good enough. So there's an interplay between personal experience and identity formation and macro level discourse and structural inequalities. So we need to think about the emotional level again, the politics of emotion, as Sarah Ahmed talks about, of pedagogical autobiographies and differences. So here is a quote from a student, a male student, who's talking about these kinds of things in our research capability, belonging and equity. So he says, when they conduct media reports on Today Tonight or a current affair and they go into a low socioeconomic environment and there's housing commission and they're painting with a broad brush. All these people have very high chance of being drug dealers and all these people have a very high chance of being dull bludgers. And I think that is a side effect of that, whether intentional or not, and that's the important part that the student is very insightful about, makes people watching think, oh, well, they're not going to achieve anything. Well, in reality, that's not true, and the reality is not there. So some really important insights coming from that student about how misrecognition plays out, that whether intentional or not, those broader discourses at play out in terms of the construction of judgments about who has the right to higher education. And not only is that made by another to another, it's also about how we make those judgments of ourselves and how they become embedded in our sense of self. This female student talks about discussions making her feel anxious and being afraid of being stupid. She says, I'm just too scared to put my hand up or just say it. Sometimes I even feel nauseous, like I want to be sick, just to say a sentence. And I'm not a shy person, but I'm just very nervous in this context. And I think this really helps us to think about the relationship between misrecognition and pedagogical expectations and practices around notions of participation that are underpinned by taken for granted practices that often serve to exclude unwittingly, because the idea of discussions is that it's going to be interactive and it allows students to have a voice and to be empowered. But the terms in which academic discussions play out, when not unpacked with students, can make people feel very anxious when they're unfamiliar with those conventions, that they may say the wrong thing, that they may reinforce their identity as being stupid or unworthy, being the wrong kind of person to be in higher education. And this is a kind of theme that emerges and reemerges in my research and also in lots of the research in the field. And this is another female student in our capability project who says, yeah, students who looked a little bit low SES They didn't look like they were going to achieve. I don't know if they did or didn't, but that was just, yeah, a lot of ethnic students, depending on what ethnicity, and also a major factor in what people thought in terms of whether they were going to achieve or do really well. So this helps us to think about the ways that not only does difference play out across a range of differences, but are also embodied in the self and the way we recognize difference through a pathologizing lens. So we need clearly a more sophisticated framework that challenges homogenizing of identity and categories of students and understands that our structures of institutionalized inequality, such as race and gender, shape individual experience. And beyond that as well, to other differences that make a difference. So Black feminist scholars have developed the concept of intersectionality, which is really important in thinking about how different structural inequalities play out at both the macro level to affect the experiences at the micro level of personal experience. And I've developed the notion of formations of difference to build on that work, but also draw from post-structural theory to capture the fluidity of power in relation to difference, that not only are there structural inequalities, such as race, class, and gender, but there are also more fluid differences that play out in relation to those structures that are at the kind of more symbolic level of making meaning of who is seen as a valuable person, who is seen as a legitimate knower, who is seen to hold authority, who is seen as bright, who is seen as smart, who is seen as having potential and capability. And this is a highly subjective process. It's not rational, it's also deeply emotional. And some of the work that I've also engaged in has thought through the relationship of these concepts with notions of time and space. So drawing on Barbara Adams' idea of timescapes has been really helpful to think about how our relationship to time and space is complicit in these kinds of inequalities, whether those are historical inequalities or the ways that residues of experiences from across our educational participation play out to shape our sensibility in higher education, whether that's as a student or as an academic, and so on. And temporal inequalities play out in and through our everyday practices, but are often reduced simply to notions of good time management skills. So regardless of our relationship to time and space, it's all about how as an individual we can effectively manage our time. And I think increasingly we're aware of this as academics in an intensified kind of sector where our workloads have become increasingly fast-paced, intensified workloads, and we're juggling many different things all at once. And that might also include commitments outside of our paid employment, with people also on casual contracts and all sorts of different contracts. But the dominant explanation is about being able to manage your time. So it's constructed, time is constructed as highly mechanistic and technocratic, about management of time, whether that's workload management or individual time management skills. And that propels us towards particular future aspirations and orientations. So students in our It's About Time research talked about becoming increasingly instrumentalized towards their learning, around learning the rhythms of the assessment deadlines and being able to determine what they need to prioritize in their studies to do well in their exams, rather than engaging in the whole process of learning, which has obviously quite significant implications. And I suppose we can say the same about the kinds of ways that we prioritize our work in higher education, depending on how we're positioned and how our workload is structured. We may or may not be able to spend more time on supporting students or be able to develop some of the other aspirations we have around our research, or be able to provide the appropriate time and space to think deeply about our pedagogical practices and the development of those, and how we do that within our communities of practice. So time is really crucial, and space, the way we use space in our thinking about questions of equity, inclusion, and difference. And of course, this is always constrained by the different rhythms, the different contexts and pressures we find ourselves in, and the different spaces, the way that the space itself is structured. So whether that's the classroom space or the virtual space, and so on, that constrains what's possible, what it is possible to do, and how it's possible to be in those spaces. Pedagogical timescapes are also about our everyday routines, habits, and practices. And this comes back to thinking about the relationship of power to questions of difference, that if we have grown up in a family whose habits, and in Borgesian terms, we might call this habitus, over time generates a disposition that is more recognizable as a capable subject within higher education structures and frameworks, then we're more likely to be recognized as capable than those who are outside of those kinds of habitus. But the question is, do we force people to conform to those rigid routines, habits, and practices, or do we open those up to different diverse values and practices, and think about ways to value those in the pedagogical spaces that we're developing? So, you know, the way we think about framing these kinds of questions leads to different kinds of strategies and practices. So in thinking about all of these different complexities that I've tried to outline in a very constrained time, I'd like to introduce you to the notion of reflexivity as a critical tool that might help us to address some of these challenges and complexities. Reflexivity builds on the idea of reflection. Reflection is very important, of course, being a reflective practitioner, but reflection tends to focus on individual self-improvement and development, whereas reflexivity builds on that to think about our relationship to power, to questions of ethical practice, to think about our assumptions, the values we bring, the histories we bring, and how that shapes the pedagogical relations that we're engaged in. And this is related to a notion coming out of Paulo Freire's work of praxis. So this is about this ongoing, cyclical, reciprocal, and collaborative process of critical reflection and action and reflection that helps us think about transformative social justice in relation to our development, the development of our practice. So coming back to this idea of the autobiography of the question, and I have a slash there because it's not just about our personal experience, it's about our relationship of our personal histories and experiences to broader institutional histories and social histories and so on, histories of our discipline. If we explore the autobiography of the question, it helps us develop a reflexive positioning, which will hopefully enable ourselves, our students, our peers to make more explicit connections between those personal histories and wider social histories in which we are part, including those that are related to inequalities and injustices. and really to trace through the taken for granted beliefs, values, perspectives, practices at play in relation to wider debates, histories, and social relations. This brings me back, though, to the idea of timescapes, because we need time and space to do this work. And part of the problem is that we're situated in highly intensified environments where we're trying to juggle all of these different things, commitments at once. So it's really about valuing the time and space to open up opportunities for reflexivity to be part of our practice. So these are just some questions that I've put forward in hope that you can take these through to your conversations across the conference and also beyond. And the other resource here is at the website www.equityhe.com, which I've put on another slide, which has a range of different resources available to help develop these kinds of reflexive approaches, including critical film resources and also the Teaching Inclusively resource that I talked about earlier. So the final part is really about how might we think about changing pedagogical, I'd rather say timescapes actually, because it's not only about space, it's also about time. And I think that really it's about being grounded in ethics of care, reciprocity in the sense that it's a two-way relational process together with our students, with our peers, within our communities, and a sense of connection. And I think that higher education has been so increasingly characterized through an emphasis on individual success, individual competition even, that this undermines this ethics of care, reciprocity, and connection that is so important to developing inclusive spaces. And that the responsibility of that can never rest on an individual. So, you know, we can't have one representative of equity, diversity, and inclusion. It has to be a shared responsibility, and that has to be embedded in our practice so that we are able to continuously think about the challenges we face in our diverse and different contexts. So we need a sustained commitment to processes of inclusion through, rather than against, difference. It's not about homogenizing, standardizing, taking out difference. It's about actually embracing difference and thinking about difference as a resource to enrich our pedagogical practices and our curricular spaces. And of course, coming back to that model of inclusion that insists on just fitting in or conforming to normative frames, we need to reject that as a profound form of misrecognition and symbolic violence, and rather embrace an approach to inclusion that emphasizes being committed to exploring meaning through the inclusion of practices across, through, and with difference, engaging contestation and challenging homogenization, and also challenging binary thinking. So, you know, when we think about questions of gender, for example, I think it's important as a feminist scholar that we still understand the structures of patriarchy institutionally that shape different participants' experiences, but we also need to embrace and understand different gendered experiences that are not just binarized across the idea of masculine, feminine, male, female, and so on. In CEHE, we've developed a praxis-based pedagogical, ethical, methodological framework, which is trying to bring all of these ideas together. So really trying to frame this in terms of praxis and that real deep commitment to ongoing critical action, reflection, action through relational timescapes for pedagogies of difference. And drawing on multidimensional social justice principles, such as holding together the challenges of redistribution together with recognition and representation. And representation is about ensuring that those who have been underrepresented and misrepresented or haven't been politically able to participate in decision-making processes and shaping processes are part of that project. So if we think about, for example, indigenizing the curriculum, a kind of multidimensional social justice framework will not be about just bringing in some indigenous material into the curriculum, but it would be about recognizing the ways in which histories of particular white-centered and westernized values and knowledges have been foregrounded in the curriculum, and recognizing how other knowledges have been excluded and bringing those to play, and full representation of indigenous communities in the process of reshaping the curriculum. Pedagogies of difference is a concept that I've been developing, which draws on praxis and multidimensional social justice framework, but also includes attention to a sense of embodiment, that our authority is connected to the histories of particular embodiments of authority in higher education, knowledge, who holds knowledge, where knowledge rests, and how that's, how that's embodied in particular personhoods, which has an effect on who can take up those positions. And subjectivity, which is connected to those formations of difference, how different identities are constructed and formed, how they're related to histories of pathologization of particular groups and communities, and how that shapes the way we understand difference in institutions such as higher education and in our own disciplinary context. And finally, not ignoring those emotional layers to the development of these kinds of social justice practices. So I'll end with a quote from my recent, or more recent, it's actually 3 years old now, article, Difference in Higher Education Pedagogies, Gender, Emotion, and Shame. So this helps us to, pedagogies of difference help us to reimagine difference, not as a problem to be regulated for disciplinary processes of standardization and homogenization, but as a critical resource to reflexively develop collective and ethical participation in pedagogical spaces. Such collective participation is not based on a notion that we can overcome power relations, but an understanding that power is complex and fluid and is an inevitable dimension of pedagogical relations in which difference is and should be part of the dynamics in which we create meaning and understanding. I hope that some of this will resonate with your discussions over the next couple of days and also into your practices moving forward. It's a deep honor to share my work with you. I hope it's been helpful. Thank you very much.